For the first time in weeks, warships that were supposed to be holding position have started moving again, not retreating, not standing down, repositioning quietly toward the single, narrowest, most contested stretch of water on the entire planet. And if you know anything about how naval standoffs actually work, you know that ships don't reposition for no reason. They reposition because someone, somewhere, just changed the plan. Tonight, we're going to show you exactly where these ships are moving, why the timing lines up with one of the most dangerous statements to come out of Tehran in months, and why the last time American warships moved like this in these exact waters, shots were fired within days. You would think, after everything this region has already been through, that another ship movement wouldn't be the thing to worry about. This is a strait that has already seen a war. Since the closing days of February this year, the United States and Israel have carried out strikes across Iranian territory. Iran has attempted to seal off the Strait of Hormuz entirely, and Washington has enforced and lifted and reimposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports not once, but multiple times, as ceasefires collapsed and negotiations restarted. Just last month, that blockade came back for a second time after yet another round of talks broke down. So when warships move again now, it isn't the opening scene of a new crisis. It's the next chapter of one that never actually ended, just went quiet for a while. And quiet in this story has never once meant safe. Before we go further, you need to understand exactly what's at stake in the water we're talking about. The Strait of Hormuz is barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, a bottleneck between Iran on one side and Oman and the UAE on the other. Before this war began, roughly a quarter of the entire world's seaborne oil trade and a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas passed through that gap every single day. It is, without exaggeration, the most economically important stretch of water on Earth. When ships stop moving through it normally, fuel prices move within hours, not weeks. And when warships start repositioning around it, traders, insurers, and governments everywhere start recalculating risk in real time, because everyone in this industry has learned the same lesson over the past 6 months. In the Strait of Hormuz, military movement and market panic are now the same signal. Let's start with what actually triggered this. Just days ago, a senior military advisor to Iran's supreme leader went on Iranian state television and delivered one of the bluntest threats of the entire conflict. He said Iran would not allow any route through the Strait of Hormuz other than the one Iran itself controls. And he said it in the most direct terms possible. If the United States brings warships into what Iran considers an illegal route through the strait, Iran will target them. Not warn them, not intercept them, target them. That's not the language of a government posturing for domestic television. That's the language of a government drawing a line it intends to enforce and daring the most powerful navy on Earth to cross it. And the U.S. Navy has already been quietly testing exactly that line. Central Command has confirmed that under the reimposed blockade, its forces have redirected 44 commercial vessels, attempting to move through the strait, disabled 2, and boarded 2 more, all in the span of a few weeks. This isn't a symbolic patrol anymore. This is active, ongoing enforcement, ship by ship, in waters Iran has explicitly said it will defend by force. Every one of those 44 redirections, every disabling, every boarding, is a moment where 2 hostile militaries occupy the same narrow channel of water with weapons live and orders to act. Multiply that by weeks, and you start to understand why analysts are calling this one of the most sustained points of friction anywhere in the world right now. Now let's talk about the ships themselves, because the specific vessels involved tell you almost as much as the movements do. Guided missile destroyers, the workhorse of this entire standoff, have been the primary tool of enforcement, precise, fast, capable of both offense and missile defense in the same platform. Backing them is a carrier strike group anchored by the USS Abraham Lincoln, a nuclear-powered supercarrier whose presence alone changes the strategic math for everyone in the region, because a carrier group isn't just a ship, it's an entire self-contained airbase, radar network, and strike package floating in international waters. When destroyers start repositioning specifically in the direction of the strait while a carrier group holds position nearby, military analysts read that as a very particular kind of posture. Not retreat, not de-escalation, coverage. The kind of formation you build when you expect trouble and want the ability to respond to it from multiple directions at once. This isn't the first time this exact dance has played out either, and the history here matters. Back in April, 2 American destroyers, the USS Frank E. Peterson and the USS Michael Murphy, transited the Strait of Hormuz for the first time since the war began, officially described as part of a mission to clear sea mines that Iran's Revolutionary Guard had laid across the channel. Iran denied the transit had even happened the way the U.S. described it. Weeks later, the U.S. launched something called Operation Project Freedom, an operation explicitly designed to escort commercial vessels through the strait using a combination of guided missile destroyers, over 100 land and sea-based aircraft, and unmanned platforms operating both above and below the surface. Within hours of that operation beginning, the U.S. and Iranian militaries were exchanging fire. American forces reported destroying 6 Iranian small boats and intercepting Iranian cruise missiles and drones aimed at the escort operation. That escort mission lasted only 2 days before it was quietly halted. The pattern from that episode is exactly the pattern analysts are watching for again right now. Warships move first, tension spikes almost immediately, and actual combat has, more than once, followed within 48 hours. If you think this is just about warships facing off against small boats, the picture gets considerably more unsettling once you look at what the US has been using to actually strike back. Just recently, 3 Saronic Corsair unmanned surface craft, essentially autonomous attack boats with no crew aboard, were used in a strike on an Iranian port. This is a detail worth sitting with. The United States is now running offensive naval operations against Iranian territory using unmanned systems, which means American commanders can escalate strikes inside Iranian waters without risking a single American sailor's life in the process, and that changes the political calculus around escalation entirely. Wars where you can strike without risking your own personnel tend to escalate faster, not slower, because the domestic political cost of casualties, historically the single biggest brake on military escalation, is removed from the equation. And then there's the tanker traffic itself, which tells its own quiet story of just how abnormal this normal shipping lane has become. Independent shipping analysts tracking vessel movements say only a handful of ships, usually fewer than 10 a day, are currently transiting the strait, a fraction of what moved through this waterway before the war. That's despite public statements from American officials claiming traffic is recovering and that a deal to fully restore shipping could be reached within days. The gap between what officials are saying publicly and what shipping trackers are actually recording is exactly the kind of gap that, in this conflict, has repeatedly preceded a fresh round of escalation rather than a genuine de-escalation. Let's put some real numbers in front of you, because the scale of what's already happened here is easy to lose track of amid the daily headlines. Since the naval blockade was first imposed in April, Central Command reports having intercepted 85 vessels attempting to breach it, while independent shipping trackers estimate that roughly 26 vessels have managed to bypass the blockade entirely. The U.S. government estimates the blockade has cost Iran close to $5 billion in lost oil revenue since it began, with the Treasury Secretary claiming a daily cost approaching $500 million at points during the campaign. On the casualty side, the broader Strait of Hormuz crisis has already seen at least 17 merchant ships damaged, several of them abandoned entirely by their crews, 2 merchant ships captured outright by Iranian forces, and at least a dozen seafarers killed or reported missing since the closure began. These aren't projections. These are documented outcomes from a crisis most people outside the shipping and energy industries have barely noticed, is still ongoing. Let's widen the lens and tour how the rest of the region is reacting to this exact moment, because the response outside Washington and Tehran tells you just how seriously everyone else is taking it. Start with Oman, geographically positioned right across the strait from Iran and functioning as the only consistent diplomatic bridge between Washington and Tehran throughout this entire conflict. Omani mediators have been running the sole active negotiating track aimed at establishing something like a safe shipping corridor through the strait, modeled loosely on how international shipping lanes were managed through the Strait of Malacca during past periods of regional tension. Every time warships reposition, Omani diplomats reportedly have to restart trust-building efforts from scratch, because movement like this reads to Tehran as bad faith no matter how the Pentagon frames it publicly. Move to the wider Gulf, and you find the same nervous calculus we've seen throughout this crisis. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, both sitting close enough to the strait to feel any escalation immediately, have spent the past several months quietly building up their own missile defense capacity and deepening intelligence sharing with Washington, all while publicly urging restraint from every side involved. Their fear has never really changed. A war fought over the Strait of Hormuz doesn't stay contained to Iran and the United States. It happens in waters and airspace their own economies depend on completely, and a wrong move by any single ship captain, on any side, could turn a tense standoff into a shooting war overnight. Now look at the oil markets themselves, because they've become almost a live instrument for measuring this crisis in real time. When the last ceasefire was announced, Brent crude fell nearly 16% in a single move, dropping to just over $92 a barrel, an almost instantaneous reaction to the mere possibility of stability returning to this stretch of water. That kind of price swing on a single announcement tells you everything about how tightly wound global energy markets have become around this exact strait. Which means every time warships reposition somewhere on a trading floor, that same volatility starts loading back into the price of a barrel of oil before a single missile has even been fired. If this pattern feels familiar, it's because history has run something close to this exact playbook before. During this so-called tanker war of the 1980s, American warships escorted reef-flagged tankers through the Gulf while Iranian forces mined the waters and launched speedboat attacks, a years-long standoff that eventually culminated in direct naval combat between the U.S. and Iranian navies. That earlier conflict ended, in part, with the accidental shoot-down of a civilian airliner by an American warship that mistook it for an attacking aircraft, a tragedy that still shapes how naval commanders in these waters think about the risk of misidentification under pressure today. The lesson from that era, repeated by naval historians ever since, is blunt. In waters this narrow, with warships this close to hostile forces this often, the line between deterrence and disaster is measured in seconds of decision-making, not days of diplomacy. Let's widen the lens even further, because the reaction from powers outside this immediate region says almost as much as anything happening in the water itself. Israel, whose own strikes on Iran back in February helped set this entire chain of events in motion, has watched every phase of the Hormuz standoff with a level of attention bordering on obsession. Because Israeli officials view any weakening of pressure on Iran's economy, including its ability to export oil through this strait, as directly connected to Iran's ability to eventually rebuild whatever military and nuclear capacity it lost during the war. Any sign that the blockade is softening or that warships are pulling back rather than pushing forward tends to generate immediate, pointed pushback from Israeli officials, urging Washington to maintain maximum pressure. Then there's Russia and China, both of whom have spent this entire conflict positioned as quiet beneficiaries rather than active participants. China, in particular, remains one of the largest buyers of Iranian oil, even under blockade conditions. And Chinese state media has repeatedly criticized the American naval presence in the strait as an illegal act of economic coercion against a sovereign nation. Neither Moscow nor Beijing has offered to mediate. Neither has pushed Iran toward the negotiating table. For both capitals, a United States tied down enforcing a naval blockade in the Persian Gulf is a United States with less bandwidth, less political capital, and less military flexibility to focus on flashpoints that matter more directly to them, whether that's Eastern Europe or the South China Sea. The longer this standoff drags on, the more it quietly serves interests thousands of miles away from the strait itself. Now consider the insurance and shipping industry, because in a very real sense, this entire crisis is being priced, hour by hour, by people who have never fired a weapon and never will. War risk insurance premiums for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz have reportedly climbed to levels not seen since the depths of the tanker war in the 1980s, with some underwriters reportedly declining to offer coverage at any price for certain vessel classes attempting the crossing. Major shipping conglomerates have quietly rerouted portions of their fleets around the Cape of Good Hope, a detour that can add 2 to 3 weeks to a single voyage and burn through enormous amounts of additional fuel. Every one of those rerouted ships represents a company deciding, with real money, that the risk of a warship encounter or a mine strike in the strait now outweighs the cost of sailing an extra 10,000 miles to avoid it entirely. Iran's decision-making structure has itself been under strain, with power reportedly consolidating around a smaller circle of military and clerical figures than existed before the war began. A senior advisor going on state television to threaten American warships directly may reflect a coordinated strategic decision by that inner circle. It may also reflect internal pressure from hardliners within Iran's own military establishment, pushing for a harder line than more cautious voices in Tehran might otherwise prefer. Outside, analysts genuinely don't know which of those scenarios is closer to the truth, and that uncertainty about who is actually driving Iranian decision-making right now is itself one of the more unsettling aspects of this entire standoff, because de-escalation is far harder to negotiate when it isn't entirely clear who inside the other government actually has the authority to agree to it. Let's also be honest about what ordinary people watching this story from thousands of miles away can actually expect to feel from all of this, because geopolitics like this rarely stays abstract for long. Every spike in tension in the Strait of Hormuz shows up, with a short delay, at gas pumps and grocery store shelves far outside the Middle East, because energy costs ripple through the price of everything that has to be shipped, trucked, or manufactured using fuel that ultimately traces back to markets. This strait helps supply. The connection between a destroyer repositioning off the coast of Oman and the price you pay to fill up your car isn't always obvious in the moment, but analysts tracking this conflict since February have shown again and again that it's real, it's fast, and it's one of the clearest ways this specific, distant standoff actually reaches into daily life, for people who have never given the Strait of Hormuz a second thought before this year. Because the human chain of command behind these ship movements matters more than most coverage of this crisis ever mentions. Central Command, under Admiral Brad Cooper, has become the operational face of this entire standoff, issuing the daily notices to mariners, authorizing interdictions, and absorbing the responsibility every time a boarding or a disabling action makes international headlines. Every decision to redirect a commercial vessel, every choice to fire on an Iranian small boat, runs through a chain of command that has to weigh, in real time, the difference between enforcing a blockade and triggering a war neither side has officially declared. That's an extraordinary amount of pressure to place on individual commanding officers, standing watch on individual ships in the middle of the night, thousands of miles from Washington, with rules of engagement that have to account for a threat as blunt as the one Iran's leadership just issued on state television. And it's worth being clear-eyed about what targeting actually means in the specific language Iran has used, because military analysts don't read that word casually. When a senior advisor to Iran's supreme leader says warships taking an unauthorized route will be targeted, he is not describing a diplomatic protest or a strongly worded objection. In military terminology, that is a direct threat to use lethal force against a NATO-aligned naval powers warships, the kind of statement that, in almost any other context, would itself be treated as an act of war. The fact that this threat was delivered on state television, rather than through private diplomatic channels, tells you it was meant as much for the Iranian public as for Washington, a signal of resolve aimed at reassuring a domestic audience that has lived through 6 months of economic pain from the blockade, that Tehran is not simply absorbing the pressure without pushing back. There's also a technological dimension to this standoff that rarely gets discussed outside specialist defense circles, and it changes how quickly a single miscalculation could spiral. Both sides in this standoff are now operating a mix of crewed and uncrewed platforms in the same tight stretch of water, American-guided missile destroyers and unmanned Saronic Corsair attack boats alongside Iranian small boats, drones, and shore-based anti-ship missile batteries. Unmanned systems complicate the entire calculus of escalation in ways traditional naval doctrine was never built to handle. The commander deciding whether to fire on an approaching vessel has to make that call in seconds, and the presence of unmanned platforms on both sides means the traditional signals used to de-escalate a tense encounter, a crewed vessel visibly changing course, a radio call answered by a human voice, are increasingly unavailable in the exact moments when they matter most. Zoom out for a moment and consider what this specific standoff means for how future conflicts over global choke points might play out, because naval strategists studying this crisis in real time are drawing lessons that extend far beyond Iran. The Strait of Hormuz has effectively become a live laboratory for what a modern great power-adjacent blockade actually looks like. Economic warfare, autonomous systems, information warfare over shipping statistics, and constant low-level naval friction, all playing out simultaneously without ever quite crossing into a formally declared war. Defense planners in other contested waterways around the world, the Strait of Malacca, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Taiwan Strait, are reportedly studying exactly how this standoff has unfolded, because the tactics being tested here in real time, blockade enforcement using unmanned vessels, managed shipping corridors negotiated through third-party mediators, will likely become the template for the next major maritime confrontation somewhere else on the map, whenever and wherever that turns out to be. To understand how we actually arrived at this exact moment, it helps to walk the timeline in full, because the speed and scale of this conflict is easy to lose track of amid months of overlapping headlines. This entire crisis traces back to February 28th of this year, when the United States and Israel launched surprise coordinated strikes against Iranian military and government targets, an operation that included the assassination of Iran's supreme leader and several senior officials alongside him, an event with almost no precedent in the modern history of state-on-state conflict. Iran's response was immediate. The Revolutionary Guard moved to seal the Strait of Hormuz entirely, mining the waters and attacking merchant vessels, attempting passage, triggering what shipping analysts quickly labeled a global fuel crisis. By mid-March, the U.S. had launched an aerial campaign specifically aimed at reopening the strait by force, targeting Iranian naval vessels and drone units directly. By April, with peace talks in Islamabad having collapsed, President Trump ordered a full naval blockade of Iranian ports, a blockade that has since been paused for ceasefires, reimposed after their collapse, and reimposed again as recently as last month. In between, there was Operation Project Freedom in early May, a 2-day escort operation that led directly to an exchange of fire and the destruction of Iranian small boats. There was a ceasefire, greeted by a nearly 16% one-day drop in oil prices, only for that same ceasefire framework to eventually break down over disagreements about how the blockade itself should be interpreted. And now, in the first weeks of August, with Iran's own military leadership issuing its most direct threat yet against American warships, those same warships are moving again. 6 months in, this is not a new crisis. It is the same crisis, still unresolved, simply cycling through its most dangerous phase for what may be the third or fourth time this year alone. It's also worth stepping back and asking why a single narrow strait has been allowed to dominate half a year of American military strategy in the region, because the answer says something uncomfortable about how fragile the entire global economy actually is around a handful of choke points like this one. Modern economies run on the assumption that oil and gas move freely through a small number of critical corridors, the Strait of Hormuz chief among them, and that assumption is held for decades, largely because no government has been willing to test it this aggressively for this long. What's happening in these waters right now is effectively a real-time stress test of that assumption, and 6 months in, the results have not been reassuring. Every time this conflict escalates, energy markets move within hours. Every time it appears to de-escalate, shipping companies wait weeks before trusting the calm enough to send their fleets back through. That mismatch, fast panic, slow trust, is exactly the kind of imbalance that keeps this specific standoff dangerous long after the headlines fade, because the world's economic dependence on this stretch of water hasn't gone anywhere, even when public attention has. Before we close, it's worth sitting honestly with what we don't know, because that's often the most important part of any story like this one. We don't know, with certainty, whether this specific repositioning is the opening move of a fresh confrontation or simply routine enforcement that happens to coincide with a provocative statement from Tehran. We don't know whether the Oman-mediated talks are genuinely close to a breakthrough, as American officials publicly claim, or effectively stalled, as the thin shipping traffic numbers suggest. What we do know is the track record. Every time this exact combination has appeared before, warships moving, Iran issuing direct threats, official statements promising an imminent deal, this conflict has escalated before it de-escalated, not the other way around. That track record doesn't guarantee history repeats itself again this week. It simply explains why so many people whose job it is to watch this waterway for a living are treating this movement as more than routine. Let's go back to where we started. Ships that were holding position have started moving again, and ships in this part of the world don't move without a reason. We told you that when warships reposition in the Strait of Hormuz, it has, more than once already this year, been the opening move rather than a footnote. Everything we've shown you tonight, the timing against Iran's warning, the scale of enforcement actions already underway, the echo of exactly what happened before shots were fired in May, points toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. This war never actually ended when the headlines moved on to other stories. It simply went quiet in this exact stretch of water, waiting for the next miscalculation to bring it back into view. And in the Strait of Hormuz, the world has already learned more than once this year that quiet water is rarely calm water. One final detail worth leaving you with. 6 months into this crisis, the Strait of Hormuz has already produced 2 false dawns, 2 moments where officials, markets, and headlines alike briefly believed the worst was over, only for talks to collapse and warships to move again within weeks. If this repositioning turns into a 3rd false dawn, it will barely make news beyond the shipping and energy trade press that's been tracking this conflict from day one. But if it turns into the moment this standoff finally tips into the kind of sustained combat naval historians have been quietly expecting, since the tanker war comparisons started back in the spring, it will be the story dominating every headline within days. And by then, the warning signs, the threat from Tehran, the enforcement numbers, the thinning tanker traffic will already be old news sitting right here, exactly where we left them tonight. Thank you for watching. If this analysis helped you understand what's really happening beneath the surface of this story, make sure to like this video and drop a comment so more people understand exactly what's at stake in these waters right now. We'll be watching this strait closely, and we'll bring you the truth the moment anything changes.